Bible study. I am very excited to get started this week. This week we are in Parasha 20, which is called Per Today. And remember, last week I said that last week's portion and this week's portion is usually done together, but not this year because this year is a leap year, which means there's an entire extra month in this year, and that's quite significant. This month is also that begins the 2nd of March, the evening of the 2nd of March. Also, it's the last month before we enter into the month that we have Passover. So it's a time of preparation, some extra time given to us to really get our hearts ready for the word that God has prepared for each of us for this Passover. So let's look at this week's portion. Is in Exodus 38 to Exodus 40. And this will end the chapter of Exodus for us. And as I've listened to teachings of these two portions together and separate in the past, it's very easy that people sort of, when they get to the end of Exodus, feels that it's boring. And then we switch over to Leviticus, which is filled with all of these laws. And then people think, oh boy, you know, and I would just really want to encourage you to stick with it, to find the connections of all of these things that you find mundane and link them to your own life and to your own experiences, because the word of God is alive and there's no such thing as a boring section or a section that you can just skip over in the Bible. It's all godly inspired words, and therefore it's important for us to teach but also to learn. And then the Haftorah portion for this week is 1 Kings 7 and 1 Kings 8, and we're going to look at 1 Kings 8 a bit this week, and then the Brit Parashahs in Hebrews and Corinthians. I'm not really going to touch on that this week. I'm going to do a piece out of Matthew 1. And so let's get started. So for this week, we are going to look at the temple in the Exodus, which is the temple it's referred to most often as the temple in the wilderness. And then we're going to look at Solomon's temple. Now, in Hebrew, the name for Solomon is Shlomo. And I always find it a little bit funny because that's my brother's dog's name. And, you know, so that's how I remember it, because Solomon and Shlomo is not that easy to connect. And then the next we're going to look at is Yeshua's temple and what he did with the temple and what's the purpose. And then lastly, we're going to look at the temple to come. So the first 3 temples have all been temples that's been in the past. We've already seen these temples. We know what happens with these temples and in these temples. But the temple to come is the one when the New Jerusalem is set up, and we'll be looking at that a bit later as well. So I first want to start with the story of Exodus, how it starts and how it finishes. It's always very important to look at these things. Okay, so the story of the Exodus is God recognizing his people, right? So we all know that Joseph went down to Egypt first, and then he met up with his brothers again at the end of Genesis, and then his entire family moved down to Goshen, and they stayed in Goshen for around about 300 years. Okay, and then what happens is God helps them out of their slavery, and we have the story of them leaving the Exodus and the plagues, and then they get to the wilderness, and all of this takes a lot of miracles. And then we see that they make a few mistakes once they are in the wilderness, and one of the first ones is complaining at the bitter waters, and then I think the most prominent one is the sin of the golden calf. And God, you see, keeps on giving them second chances. The amazing thing we have to remember about this is that Moses interceded on behalf of the people. And then the last thing is that God reunites himself by placing a tabernacle in their midst. And Exodus finishes with them preparing this tabernacle and how it's made. And I can't believe, I think I listened to Monty Judah this week, and he said that if he was one of the people that was involved in the makings of all of these things, the fear of God would have really been upon him to make every single thing perfect, because that's what God deserves. Okay, so we are going to be comparing the tabernacles that we find in the Bible. And I'm just going to lift up a few things of each tabernacle. Before I start off, I want to remind you that we are the tabernacle of God. So not only are we going to be comparing all of these tabernacles and what they stand for, sort of like a menorah pattern, but what we also need to connect all of these tabernacles to is ourselves and the sequence in which we find them and how they progress, how they change, what that means, and what does that mean for us. So for me personally, I always think back of Genesis, where it says that let's make man into our image and into our likeness, and into the image of God we created them. And what that actually means is that we are created in the image of God, but we need to grow into his likeness. And how do we do that? Well, God gives us commandments to do that, right? And so I think for myself and for this week, I looked at these tabernacles and I thought, well, if the presence of God lives in these tabernacles, but I'm also the tabernacle, and the tabernacle sort of grew in how the people that built them and where they were built represents them. How does that affect me growing in the likeness of God? So the tabernacle in the wilderness is in Exodus. And we know that's sort of a barren place. And we all know that that's where God met up with him. That's where God revealed himself to the people. And I think most of us came to faith. I mean, all of us, some of you might have grown up in homes where you grew up in different religions or maybe no religion at all. And somewhere in your life, you hit the wilderness. Or maybe you grew up knowing God, you went to church, but you knew God from other people's experiences, and God maybe took you into the wilderness. But this is generally where our journey starts, is in the wilderness. It's a tough time in our lives, and we are holding on to God for dear survival, for our water and our food, our daily needs, etc., etc. And so what it represents is the starting off of this journey for each of us in this barren place where God does all of these miracles and he saves us from Egypt. And he also comes and takes us into a place that might be even a bit worse physically for us, but spiritually is where he meets us and he gives us his 10 words, his 10 commandments. And he starts helping us to build and rebuild this tabernacle, which is our body, so that it can be fit for his presence to dwell inside or among us. Okay, so it's a building of new relations, learning God's patterns and God's ways. He, in Exodus, tells them exactly, this is the pattern in which you are to build the tabernacle. And then, of course, starting the building, starting the making the linen, and getting the bronze and the silver and the gold together, making your sacrifices. Start putting in the hard work to do this. And it is hard work to subdue your flesh and to get your flesh under control and your physical nature and your own will and plan and emotions, to get them under control. But once you do and you've mastered that, your body becomes a place where the Spirit of God dwells and where your spirit can freely connect with God. And that's when the real amazing thing starts to happen. The next tabernacle we find is Solomon's tabernacle, and we all know that this tabernacle was the most amazing tabernacle that has ever been built. It was miraculous in every way, and that Solomon did not spare a penny in order to build this thing, to make this tabernacle over and beyond what was needed. And even the sacrifices that he brought, it was thousands of sacrifices that were brought, and he really just wanted to honor God. And so if we look at 1 Kings 8, we'll find a few things. First of all, when David dies, now David is the father of Solomon, and when he dies, David really, his heart was to build this tabernacle, but God said, no, I will raise up one of your sons to do so, and Solomon was the one to do so, and he took over the reign as king from his father David, and then he went on to build this amazing tabernacle. And so what he did is he asked God for wisdom, and God then gave him the wisdom to build this tabernacle. And I think that's amazing, because in Proverbs, the word says that fear of the Lord is the start of wisdom. If I remember, I think it's that way around. I don't hope it's the other way around. But the start of wisdom is fear of the Lord. It might be. And so maybe just check me on that one. But he asked for wisdom. And something else that we need to remember is that the spirit of wisdom is one of the 7 spirits of God. And so he asked for wisdom, and what the wisdom helped him to do was build a place fit for God's presence. And so what he did is what we need to do is we can learn from Solomon in not holding back from what is God's. Nothing that we have is our own. It's all borrowed. It's a gift from God. And Solomon knew that, so he didn't hold any riches back from God. What he did was perfecting and going over and beyond what was expected of him. And we must do the same with our tabernacles. We must go over and beyond what is expected of us to give back to God, to give back to his kingdom, to ensure that nothing in our lives we hold back and say, God, I just want to cling on to this one thing. There's this amazing story that I once heard. Grant Luton actually did it in one of his teachings, where he spoke about a guy. He's a missionary, and he was sent out to do some work, and his wife and 2 kids stayed home. And whilst he was gone, his 2 kids fell sick and they died. And on the day that the husband came home, so let's say they died the day before, the wife clothed the kids and she washed them, she put them on their beds, she closed the doors and welcomed her husband home. And her husband was well versed in the laws of God. And she sat him down and she gave him dinner. And at some stage, she asked him, she said, while you were gone, a traveler came and he gave me 2 precious rubies. And he asked me to keep these 2 rubies safe. And the traveler came back after a while and asked me to return the rubies to him. What must I do? And his immediate answer was that you must give the rubies back, because they were never yours in the first place. And I think you and I, we all know what this means and what this represents. The 2 children represents the 2 rubies. And in that, I always, this is a story I often tell people that have lost someone, a loved one, a dear one, to explain to them that we mustn't hold on to things that were God's in the first place. Grant Luton says, as long as you hold on to your life, as long as you hold on to your little things, God will take it forcefully and it will not be nice. But if you sacrifice it freely and you open your hand, God will return it to you in a time to come. And so we see in this tabernacle, it's a giving of yourself. It's a praying for the nation as well, because what Solomon did before they started dedicating the altar, so they brought, the altar was, the tabernacle was built, and they brought in the Ark of the Covenant. And once the Ark of the Covenant was inside of the Holy of Holies, then the tabernacle was ready to be dedicated. And before he did that, he prayed on behalf of the nation. He interceded on behalf of the nation. And we must do the same. We must intercede and pray on behalf of other people, on behalf of God's people. We must pray for Jerusalem, but we must also be like Rahab, to have the savvy to intercede for the people in our lives that we love, that might not be on the same road that we are. Because that's how gracious our God is he allows us to intercede on behalf of other people. And then sacrificing to God without limitations, I already touched on this. And then it's well known that Solomon dedicated the temple on the Feast of Sukkot. And just the link for Sukkot will come up maybe a bit later again. But what he did is he held this 14-day feast of sacrifices and praising God, and this whole celebration. And if you read in 1 Kings 8 verses 2, you'll see that he did this in the month of Itanim, sorry. And this is a profound word. It's only found this one time in the Old Testament. And if you go read up a bit more about it, we don't have enough time for it today. And I myself am still trying to wrap my head around this. But in the question questions you need to ask yourself in the review section at the way of the end. I'll give you some more information about this, but just so that you have the reference as to where this word comes from. And then we're going to look a bit at the number 14. We find the number 14 often in the things that I studied for this week to compare these tabernacles. But the first place I thought is the 14 days that they had this piece of dedicating the tabernacle. And 14 is a multiple of 7, which means 2 times 7 equals 14. And it's important because it's double the number of 7, which is completion and perfection. And the number 14 is also interesting because that's the number of the day on which we start Passover and then go immediately into unleavened bread. And I just thought that's interesting because we are nearing Passover. For us, it will be in April this year. And I think it's usually in April. And on the 14th day, we start Passover. And that's also a day where they sacrifice a lamb. It's a double measure of 7, which is completeness. I already said that. It's also the number of Messiah. And that will link us to our next tabernacle that we'll be looking at. And also, again, I said Sukkot will come up in a link later. It's also Sukkot, okay? Because Sukkot, on each of the 7 days of Sukkot, they sacrificed 14 lambs. And we'll be looking at Matthew 1. And specifically for this section, I looked at verse 23, because in verse 23, it speaks about Emmanuel, and we'll get to that now. But in Matthew 1, we see the genealogy of Messiah, and it's also done in 14 generations. So there you again see 14. And it also means deliverance and salvation, and that's how it's the number of Messiah. Okay, so let's look at the tabernacle of Yeshua. This is the time where we realize that the Spirit of God will enter into us, and we are these tabernacles. And the amazing thing is that Yeshua came and he lived out this life to give us this example of how to live out a life where we are fit so that the Spirit of God can dwell inside of us. And so some things I want to just lift out of Messiah's life is he was an extremely humble man. He didn't take any credit for anything he did. He gave all the credit to the Father. And I think sometimes for us, it's difficult to not boast of our own success or what we think or assume is our own success, to not have pride and contempt, think we're better than other people or think we deserve better, and not boasting of our own accomplishments. And something else in John 1 verses 14, and here we have the 14 again. The Word became a human being and lived among us. Okay, and so they describe the Word of God as living among us, and how the Word became a living being, which is our Messiah, and lived among us. And among us is the same phrase that is used. Among is the same phrase that's used for God's presence to come live among us. And Yeshua made his tabernacle with people. It's a congregation, it's a fellowship, and that's why we are living stones in this tabernacle. And as we are talking about stones, that will also link to the word etanim. So if you do your study on etanim and stones, you will see that that's also linked to etanim, and that's why I've put it in. But we are to be living stones in his tabernacle. And through Yeshua, God does dwell in his people. You see, it's because of his righteousness, because of the life of righteousness that he lived, that we have this connection between us and God. Because what happened after Yeshua was crucified is that veil where we find all of the cherubim on, that separates the holy place from the Holy of Holies. That veil tore in half, and we see it as if there's this new accessibility to the presence of God, all because of one man's righteousness and sacrifice on behalf of us. And so just think, if we live lives like Solomon and Yeshua, we do not hold back any of our own things from God, and we allow him to be fulfilled through our sacrifices and our giving of a humble life, that through Yeshua living in us, we can maybe also make a place where his spirit can dwell. And that's why it's so important to be in congregations, to be in fellowship with people, because it's in our fellowship of us coming together that the presence of God is also elevated to be brought forward, to live among other people. And it's when we come together as living stones in this tabernacle of Messiah. And then the last tabernacle I want to look at is the tabernacle to come. And this is in Revelation, and I just want to double check. Revelation 21, where we find this tabernacle, and it actually speaks of the new Jerusalem will come down out of heaven, and it will probably be at the Feast of Sukkot. Okay, and everything will be fulfilled. And if we want to take part in this celebration, we need to make sure that our tabernacles are growing, that we're not stuck in the wilderness, that's not the place that we are stuck at, that we're always in the wilderness and always just surviving and always on the brink of the breakthrough, looking at Israel, but never taking it back in for God, right? As an inheritance. We need to move forward. We need to progress. We need to grow into God's likeness, so that we can take part at this amazing feast where this new Jerusalem will start. And so what we see is we are all these tabernacles, and we must all move from the one to the other and grow from the one to the other. Okay, things to think about for this week. Where are you in the building of your tabernacle? Okay, are you stuck trying to weave the linen? Are you stuck trying to sacrifice or donate or give willingly enough gold so that God can be mirrored in the holy place? Are you sure that you are sacrificing yourself as a whole burnt offering every day? Are you lagging in that? Are you seeking the face and the presence of our amazing Father in heaven? Not that we will ever understand him, but is your intent of your heart to move closer to him, to get to know him, to have intimacy with him? Because if you are just doing the sacrifices outside, you're not moving into intimacy, then you need to ask God, what is going on? Why am I stuck in this place? And then the other thing, what is the story with the word Epani in 1 Kings 8 verses 2? I'm sorry, that should say, and what does it have to do with Peter and the fountains of the assembly of Messiah? Hopefully at some stage, we will be able to get to this. If you're able to study this on your own, that would be amazing. And then, as always, thank you very much for joining us. And I hope you have a lovely day. Shabbat Shalom.